How's that?
Good.
All right. So we had a really fun class last week. And one of the things we decided to do, and I'm sorry that I'm still such a Neanderthal about this, that I get this wrong. Yeah. Oops. But we did decide on a fun little extracurricular activity that we're going to do. After the class is done, we are going to enjoy, we're going to enjoy getting together to watch the Coen brothers take on the book of Job, A Serious Man. And here is the trailer.
Please, I need help. I've had marital problems.
Honey, I think it's time that we start talking about a divorce.
Larry, we're gonna be fine.
Professional, you name it.
Larry, we've received a number of letters denigrating you and urging us not to grant you tenure.
I need help.
We're gonna be fine.
I've tried to be a serious man.
We're gonna be fine.
Tried to do right, be a member of the community.
We're gonna be fine.
Please, just tell him I need help. Please.
We're gonna be fine.
I need help.
We're gonna be fine.
The rabbi is busy.
He didn't look busy.
He's thinking.
Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Wouldn't you love somebody to love? You better find somebody to love.
All right. Doesn't that look great? Oh, I always do that. I forget to turn off the...
I don't want it to just go away. I want an answer.
Sure. We all want the answer.
Hold on. I got to figure out how to...
Sam doesn't tell us the answer, Larry.
In the world.
So I just want people to know also I'm busy.
From now on, Rabbi, when anybody asks me about you, I'm going to say the rabbi is thinking.
Okay. All right, Jane. So I took the liberty of muting you just until you get that straightened out there. And if you have your sheets for today, and if you don't, you want to follow in your Bibles, we'll be concentrating on Matthew 23. But just before that, though, I want to pull this up for just a second. No, I'm going to ask people or perhaps Pastor Jane, you'll tell us, or you'll lead when you all know that I'm challenged with my English language. I didn't live in this country so much, and there are terms that may be used by lots of people, especially people from Iowa, that I find from Pastor Jane from time to time, that I don't really understand what they're saying.
It has something to do with manure.
Even though my mother is from Sioux City, but still, what comes to mind? Maybe we'll ask everybody. What comes to mind when you hear the word Pharisee? Go ahead and chime in. Just have you been disabled?
Hypocrite.
Hypocrite. We get a lot of that, right?
Yeah. Or the enemy.
Enemy.
Yeah.
Is there anybody here who's ever called somebody else a Pharisee? Maybe that's not a fair question. A Pharisee question.
I think of it as a legalist, like somebody who's like just legal, yeah.
So you mean like when somebody says, what do you want? He's a lawyer?
Well, more like a judge.
A judge.
Like
okay.
A judge.
So Michelle, it sounds like for you, at least in you think you're in your thought, it allows for at least a neutral or a positive image, not necessarily a negative image.
Well, I think more like how we're beginning to
Sorry, you cut out. You were.
I'm sorry. I was cutting everybody out that wasn't actually talking.
Okay.
Michelle, I apologize.
It's more like the impression that I think people are getting about how the Haredi community in Israel is controlling religious life and its impact on the people. Now that's not a criticism, it's just an impression. So I don't know enough to be really critical, but it's just an impression of how the Pharisees had impact on the society at that time.
Okay, so Michelle, something I've learned about you, I don't know that we've met before, but you obviously come from a rich Jewish background, or you're aware of what's going on. For the non-Jews amongst us, or those who are not familiar with the term, Haredi is the chosen word for those that many call ultra-Orthodox. The ones that often the men will dress in black with long beards or not shaven beards with side locks. Not always, but that's usually Haredi, the yeshiva community, the very Orthodox in this country. And in Israel, it's even a more complicated dynamic because they have political power that they don't necessarily have here in the United States, and therefore are unable to impose their will, which is a Jewish legal will, according to a very Orthodox interpretation, on the public in general. And that's in the background of Michelle's comment to us. So that's interesting coming from a Jewish point of view. Are you living on the East Coast, Michelle?
I am. I live in Florida, in Orlando.
Okay, so Florida. John, you wanted to say something, please.
I don't, the first things I think about are not Jewish or Christian per se. It's a person whose religious beliefs put rules first and people later.
Okay. Anybody else with something different or slightly different?
I think of it more as fundamentalists is the word that comes to my mind.
Okay. All right.
And kind of almost like a Philistine too. Like it's kind of it's like a lesser, like a less evolved person as a Pharisee, as opposed to like that's kind of the way it's presented in the Gospels.
Right. Okay. So in the Gospels, and we may revisit other stories, for instance, that are where Pharisees come into, but this is kind of the big chunk section. It has parallels in two other Gospels as well, but this is the doozy, right? This is where more than in any other part of the New Testament, the Pharisees are almost systematically taken to task. Now, Jane, if you could monitor from time to time the other screen, because sometimes people want to say something, they may be on the other screen, I can't see them. So the rule, folks, for those that are just joining us for the first time, this is a long study session. We don't go for the full 2 hours usually, but usually go for an hour and 45 minutes. If you need to go, we understand. If you want to say something and we don't see you and you're doing this and we still can't see you, it's not on purpose. You may be on the other screen. So just speak up, unmute yourself and mute yourself and speak up. But if you are not speaking, if you could please mute yourself, that way we don't get all the outside noises. I think everybody knows. Okay. So yeah, Pharisees. If you look at a thesaurus, thesaurus is if I'm pronouncing that right, you don't get any positive. And look at if you guys want to look on your screen, toggle away to Google. There's nothing positive there at all, really, and that's from a rich usage of many hundreds of years, and that's just in the English language. Who knows what's happening in other languages as well? But where does the term Pharisee come from? Does anybody know? It comes from the Greek, but where does it? It's very similar.
Proushim.
What's that? What do you say, Michael?
Proushim, the ones who are separated.
Separated. So Proushim, there would be a shva under the pei there. So in Hebrew, the verb pei re shin, parash, means to be aside. But it also means a primary meaning means to be aside. So those who are Proushim I have either been set aside or they have taken themselves aside or put themselves aside. And there are varying views in scholarship about the original etymology of the term. The Pharisees were around for 100 and some years before Jesus' time. They were kind of came out of the period of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. Some say they were the natural progression of the Hasidim, the pious ones during the times of the Maccabees. We don't have a lot of really good literature or good source material. Josephus is one of them. In general, about the ancient streams of Judaism, or they're not denominations, the different kinds or flavors of Judaism from 2200 years ago. So the Proushim are in there, and some say that they were set aside because of their views, were too liberal. They weren't literalists. So it's interesting, Richard, the accusations of some 2,000 years ago was that you guys are going away from the text, the oral law, as opposed to just the fundamentalist kind of looking at the Torah itself. Others say that they took themselves away from the group because they wanted to be more pious, more correct. One way or another, they are a group to contend with, at least from a literary point of view. We don't know really how much their leadership was the way that they pretend to be, or the way that it comes out of a later rabbinic view. The rabbis of the Talmud are an outgrowth of the Pharisees, even the ones in Babylonia. This is fascinating stuff, and it goes over hundreds and hundreds of years, and it goes from the land of Israel to the diaspora as well. But we're now focused on the land of Israel. Even if Matthew was right, the author of Matthew was coming from another place and talking maybe about a community in Syria, which is one of the possible understandings of Matthew, still the reality here that one can easily understand from rabbinic literature, what we have from the time of the Pharisees in our own Jewish Hebrew literature, it's very much from the land of Israel, very Palestinian in its background. I use the term as historians use it, that is, this place of the world, has nothing to do with 20th and 21st century politics. Okay, so let's see. I think maybe that's enough to say now. Then we're going to go back. What I'd like to do is to read through this chapter paragraph by paragraph, because I want to give kind of the Jewish background that I'm not sure many of our Christian brothers and sisters here have ever heard. Maybe they have, but you'll hear my take on what's the rabbinical background, or the Jewish, what is the background in the Jewish sources, the sources that stayed in the confines of Judaism, as opposed to the New Testament, which at some point went aside or was taken aside, and then to go a little bit into rabbinic literature as well. And what I'd like to do is finish off today. I know nobody here is intentionally doing any bashing of other Christian sects, that's the wrong word, I'm thinking in historical terms, other Christian denominations, but sometimes, and we got a little swept up perhaps with Mr. Anderson from Arizona, because he's so mean-spirited in how he speaks, but sometimes in this group and other groups, I hear a lot about Roman Catholicism. Some people have left that from their childhood. And I actually want to end with a Roman Catholic priest and his commentary on this chapter of Pharisees that will give us that way back. For those that are just joining us for the first time, this group is called From Holiness. That is, scripture that is was written with a goal of holiness. And I would like to believe a constructive sense for the group it was written for, and it was used at least in the beginning, but then at some point got kind of sidetracked or either led or was led. I'm working on that word Proushim, as Michael told us earlier, was either set aside or took itself aside in the direction of hatred. And the proof, of course, is the word Pharisees in the English language, as many of us know it today. And then we try to go back from holiness to hatred and back. How might we see this today? And I'm going to suggest a way of using rabbinic text to see it, how we might all understand this chapter in a positive way. And then I'd like to end on with the Roman Catholic priest. Okay. All right then. So let's see. Do we have? It's hard to know also who to call, and one of the reasons for in such a big group that I don't readily call on people to read, because sometimes people are not necessarily comfortable reading. Sometimes they don't have the sheet. But Wanda, do you have the sheet in front of you? Do you have the text?
Mark would
Yes,
like to
I
do
do.
it. Mark will read.
So Wanda will read, and then Mark will come afterwards. Okay.
So
So
you
if you
want
could, Wanda, if you could read from 1 to 12 for us, please.
Okay. Light here. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their Pharisees broad. Is that Pharisees?
They're phylacteries.
Phylacteries, thank you, whatever, for their phylacteries, broad, and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And they called no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted.
Okay, so not entirely objectionable in so many different aspects. What I'd like to do is to explain some of the technical things that went on here, and then we can open it up a little bit to how people feel when they read a paragraph like this. The first thing is the Moses' seat. I would imagine most people, if you hadn't seen it before and don't know a commentary, would probably think, well, that's a figurative way. There's so much figurative language here. That's a good rule for this whole entire chapter in general for us reading New Testament, as we saw with the synagogue of Satan, for instance. We don't have to take everything literal. A lot of the language is hyperbolic. It's exaggerated. It's rhetorical. And let's take a deep breath before we get all, we get our all up in arms about a particular way of saying. Well, Moses' seat actually, while some people say it's just a figure of speech to say they're putting themselves as the supreme teacher kind of a thing, many archaeologists, and this is still a bit of a debate, but many archaeologists and therefore historians have found a detail in some synagogues in the land of Israel, Hamat Tveria, the same synagogue there where we saw the mosaic floor of Helios. In some synagogues, they have found a seat in the direction, it's not in the eastern wall, because if you're in the northern part of Israel, the synagogue would face Jerusalem, would face southwards if you were another place. But these synagogues are all in the general area of northern Israel. They found a seat which many archaeologists posit to be Moses' seat. It's a symbolic seat, or it's an ornament, an architectural feature where the important person would sit, whether it was the rabbi or many perhaps would say the arche synagogue. The arche synagogue is the shul president, right? And in many synagogues, the synagogues were not necessarily they weren't led by rabbis in the same way that people think today, right? There was a elected leader or a aristocratic leader who was the head of that synagogue. Maybe that's where that person sat. But it may very well refer to an actual piece of it's not furniture exactly, because it's carved into the stone benches around. So that's Moses' seat. And if you look up Moses' seat, you can find pictures from various archaeological digs of synagogues of these particular examples of this. There aren't a lot. There's 3 or 4, maybe, I don't know. Which brings us to that very difficult word, Wanda, phylacteries. I'm guessing it's not a word you use on a regular basis. Okay, so phylacteries are what we call in Hebrew tefillin, which literally is an Aramaic term for prayers. I don't have mine here with me because I'm not at home right now at my mom's house, but maybe you've seen a picture before of traditionally a man, but today men and women that are wearing straps, black straps around their arms that are tied in a certain way in their hands, and then they have a box here that goes against their heart, opposite their heart on the left-hand side, unless you're left-handed, you put it on your right-hand side, and then a box that goes here between the eyes, but on the above on the foreline that has straps that go down and come down like this. Those are phylacteries, and you may know the
Rabbi?
Yes. You got your tefillin. Look at that. Kol hakavod lecha. Beautiful. So phylacteries are mentioned 4 times in the Torah. 2 in Exodus. It is part of the narrative right at the end before the Israelites leave Egypt. And better known are that they're mentioned twice in Deuteronomy. Better known, I say, because one of them is in the same paragraph that says, "Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha," and you shall love the Lord your God, which is quoted afterwards or put in Jesus' mouth as the most important, one of the 2 most important commandments. And there it says, "You bind them as a sign upon your arm and as frontlets between your eyes." Different translations. So the idea is that they're close to your heart and they're close to your brain. So it's almost a pedagogical tool. The fact that inside these boxes there are little scrolls that are written has been interpreted by many over the centuries, maybe even in biblical times, as an amulet of sorts. But it's clear from Deuteronomy they're not meant to protect you from evil spirits. They're meant to remind you of how to act properly. Now, if you want to show that you're a uber righteous person, an uber tzaddik, as we say in Yiddish, a super righteous person, well, you're going to have big tefillin this big and over here, right? And by the way, the same thing about the fringes. For instance, the King James Version, if you're looking at that, if you see it, you may see something like the hem of the skirt or something like that, the edge of their garment. No, this is the fringes that are on a talit as well. I'm sure Richard will get out his talit in a second and show us the fringes on his talit. And so,
do you want me to get it to show?
Sure, that's fine. But in the meantime, I'll just tell you a story of my father, bless him. I'm sitting in my father's office right now, which was my bedroom when I was a kid, and it's got all his stuff still here. My father was the president in the early 70s, maybe, the president of the LA Hebrew High School. And the principal of the school said, "Well, you and Serene, you're going to Israel. Could you bring us back 25 pairs of phylacteries of tefillin that we want to give out to the kids for their bar mitzvah or something? And you could get them much cheaper in Israel." So they came back with a suitcase that just had these things in it, and they cleared customs in New York. And as my father tells the story, they came up. There was a big, intimidating customs guy looking at him, who at the time my father said he was African American. I don't say that in any way. It's not about being African American. It's about assuming, which is not a correct assumption today either, assuming this person is not Jewish. And it's a customs official. So the guy says, "What do you have in the bag?" And my father says, "Phylacteries." He says, "What?" My father says, "Phylacteries." He says, "What?" He opens it up. He says, "Tefillin. Why'd you say you have tefillin?" In a very Yiddish accent, tefillin. So that's our family tefillin story. Richard, you want to show us your tzitzit? The fringes of your garment, of your talit, of your prayer shawl? Can't hear you, sorry.
You need to unmic yourself.
Okay, not working on his end. It's all right. Well, if you have them, to hold it up. If not, we forgive you. Okay. All right, then. I can show them to you as well. It's often what I'm wearing when we do something, a public prayer together. So, all right, we've talked about the special things. The word rabbi means instructor, it literally means master, but it's used in the context of an instructor. So these words are kind of flushed all together. How do people react to this? Is there something offensive in this at all, or is this good advice, or what do you say, folks? Yes, go ahead, Alan.
He's referring to hypocrites and hypocrisy. And he's using the form of expressing how the hypocrite will behave and what these disciples should be watching for and not judging.
Well, in all fairness, though, I don't think he's used the word hypocrites yet, has he?
No, but I'm saying that's what
Okay.
we would learn when we read this particular passage.
So my answer to that, I'm going to argue with you debate with you in that if we didn't know the section before, if we didn't know that the word was understood as hypocrites by later people, and we just saw it's talking about the Pharisees, this group of people of which I am convinced that Jesus has come from that group. I'm not alone. It's not my novel thought. It's a well spread thought. Not everybody would agree, but I would say that's it. Comes from a Pharisaic culture of that kind of study and that kind of reading, rereading, interpreting, and reinterpreting of the Torah on an ongoing basis, even during their lifetimes. I would say that here it's more about behavior. It's not about being inconsistent. To me, this section is more about a modesty and humility. Because there's nothing in here about, I don't see anything yet about the fact that they're being untrue or
they do, David. They say in the first verse, or like they do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach.
Okay.
So he is suggesting that there is do as they like they're not
okay.
they're not walking their talk.
Stand corrected. But oh boy, we've got people coming in and out all the time here. Okay, I guess
Yeah,
that's
it's okay. I'll handle that.
Okay, great.
To me,
All
it
right.
seems like he's saying that the Pharisees are really corrupt. That they're really corrupt and yeah.
Okay.
And it also says they only do things to be seen, not to do it in real life. They just want to appear like they're righteous.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay.
By the way, I'm sorry, I'm back now.
Okay.
The computer I was on froze, and I don't know what happened, so I'm on a different computer. But here's my talit, and here are the fringes.
Rabbi, I've always been told that garment is referred to as a prayer shawl in English. And when I was a boy, that's what I was taught, to call that particular garment in English, not in Hebrew or any other language, because it just seems that that's what it is.
Well, that's what it became. So good point, Alan, because in ancient times, men would wear their talit. That would be their clothes, their outer garment. It didn't necessarily look like ours, but it would be a four-cornered poncho kind of a thing that you only put the fringes when you have a garment that has four corners on it. And they would wear that all the time, not just in the synagogue, not just at prayer. That later became what is worn by some people under their shirt as a talit katan or tzitzit. For many, many years, that's what I wore under this shirt. Some people wear the fringes hanging out from beneath their shirt. You may see that on some of the Chabad rabbis in our neighborhood. And tefillin were also worn. They weren't worn just for the prayer time. They were worn whenever the area was clean. You couldn't go into the bathroom or into an area of garbage with it, but you wore them, and maybe not in the marketplace, some people say, but there were rabbis when I was in yeshiva in Israel in the 70s that every once in a while you get somebody who they would wear tefillin the whole day. Remember once, because one of the rabbis came to speak to us when we were in basic training, and once a week we had an afternoon of study because we were all yeshiva boys. And as he got out of the cab, he sat by himself and put on his tefillin, and then he started his talk. When he finished that, he took off his tefillin, got back in the cab, and left back to Jerusalem. Okay, so Mark, I'm going to ask you to read this section, but I'm first going to say that after verse 12, you'll find there's a note in the Revised Standard Version, and you'll see it. I'm pretty sure it's in King James Version itself. But there are other ancient texts that add another paragraph of woe. Another woe. By the way, anybody know how you say woe in Greek here?
Oui.
Well, it's a O in Greek, O-U-I. which to me, when I look at it, says "Oi, oi, oi vavoy." But and woe and oi are, and we they're all part of the same. In other words, it's not necessarily a. It's an expression of like ha. Okay, oi. All right. So there's another one here that talks about widows' houses and long prayer. The long prayer thing is an interesting one because there's a parallel in rabbinic literature. But let's just go on the way the text is today, which means that the editors of most Bibles that are based on scholarship have decided that's a secondary tradition. But let's go ahead. 13, Mark, go ahead. 13 to 14.
But woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them.
Okay, so we also have, it's the Pharisees and the Scribes. The Scribes, Pharisees, they're different. I don't think that they're necessarily different groups of people. I think those are alternate terms. There's a lot of discussion about what there's. So we have the word for those who speak Hebrew, Tikkun Sofrim. Perhaps you've heard of Tikkun Sofrim is the book that you prepare the Torah reading with, but there's Tikkunei Sofrim in the Torah itself are emendations that were made by rabbis in the first millennium. And so a Sofer later became, the Sofer is the scribe who copies Torah scrolls and tefillin and things like that. So the word has been used a lot, and also Ezra, the prophet Ezra, or the leader Ezra, is considered, he's kind of the second most best hero of the Pharisees in Pharisaic literature. Moses is the head honcho, but right after him comes Ezra. And Ezra's full title is Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe. Okay. So here it's a general thing. We're going to get to some specifics, but it's general in that you can't go into the kingdom of heaven if you follow them because they themselves are not getting in, right? It is kind of it's a logic. Like before I go about anything else, says Jesus according to the Gospel of Matthew, you got to go with people who there's some integrity with, because how can you learn to play saxophone from somebody who doesn't play saxophone themselves? For instance, this is the room that I learned to play saxophone in. Okay. All right.
Do you still play saxophone?
I do, and it's funny you asked that question because we just set a date for our annual fundraiser, Jews Do the Blues, on July 17th or 13th, July 13th with Deanna Bogart. Anyway, yes, and I get up and I play a little bit of blues on the saxophone. Yeah. Okay.
Something else we can all do together.
There we go.
Blues for Jews.
Okay, Mark, why don't you read another one for us?
All righty. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much of a child of hell as yourselves.
Okay, cross the sea to make converts. If I could first ask maybe those that grew up with a Jewish education, how they react to you cross the sea to make converts.
Can't hear you.
Michelle, you got something for us?
Isn't that a missionary?
It is it sounds like a missionary. It sounds it's proselytizing, right? By the way,
It doesn't happen today.
Wow.
It doesn't happen today.
Okay, so what is your first name?
Mike.
Michelle? Oh.
No, I'm asking for the person who just spoke.
Mike.
Mike Fury. Okay, so nice to meet you. So it doesn't happen today. Correct. That it's not part of normative Judaism. Well, that's not entirely true. It doesn't happen.
If you get married, if you marry a Gentile, then there's classes for your partner.
So it's a little bit of a generalization in that traditionally, from the time of after the destruction of the temple, Jews did not go out and proselytize. That's kind of well known, mostly because they would get their tochases kicked in by whoever was in charge. Doesn't matter if it was under Roman Empire, doesn't matter under Christianity, doesn't matter under Islam. You couldn't do it. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but you couldn't actively do it. We'll talk about before that in a second, but just to update people, latter part of the 20th century, in the Reform movement, Reconstructionist movement, people were a lot more open to to encouraging people to convert, why they didn't set up booths at a county fair and, you know, come be Jewish. It was an openness. Yes, a lot of it stemmed in the beginning from people marrying a non-Jew marrying a Jew and wanting the wedding to be Jewish. But then came Rabbi Harold Schulweis of blessed memory, whose books, autograph books, again, bringing back to my father, a friend of my father's and a teacher of mine, who actually began before his death, about 10, 15 years before he passed away, to talk about maybe we need to actively go out there and not be so embarrassed about convincing people to be Jewish. Or Hamidbar is an organization that is in the spirit of it's spiritual Judaism, but we are extremely open to those that come, and including them in our minyan, for instance, in our quorum of 10. Whoever's there is included. Now, that again, I don't stand we live in Palm Springs, for those that are from outside. I don't, and there's every Thursday night there's a village fest, like a street fair. I don't have a table there. There is a table by an Orthodox rabbi. Ask the rabbi. I don't have a table there saying, "Come, all you non-Jews and be Jewish." So there's varying degrees. But all that being said, if we go back 2,000 years, and we go back 2,200 years, not only were Jews actively proselytizing, they were force converting. Like Palmyra, it's called Tadmor in Hebrew. It came up in the news with Islamic State, and there were some ruins that were destroyed there. But there's a whole nation that was force converted by the Maccabees, by the Hasmoneans. I didn't when I was in my Orthodox youth, I didn't hear anything about it. But when I got to university, started to study these things. So the policies changed. So there's something feels a little bit off here. To many people, after Jews that would say, well, this doesn't sound like Jesus is being terribly exact here, but up until the destruction of the temple, that was the case. Okay, just a little historical background.
Rabbi, Michelle's got a question.
Yes, Michelle.
Well, I think there's another part to this, though. At the time that this was going on, is that there were a lot of Jews who had really fallen away from practice and lived and Greek, they were living in Greek areas. And I think there was a lot of effort to go out and bring them back to the fold, those that are living in like Mesopotamia and other areas in the Crescent and in Greece had become, very assimilated to the Greek culture, and Greek was their primary language. It wasn't Hebrew anymore. So I think there was a lot of attempt to go out and bring them back. So cross the sea business, I think, is referring to that to some degree.
Okay, so the possible areas of dispute might be: does the word to the proselyseos, whatever the word is in Greek, but it's the word that gives us the English proselytes, does that apply to Jews themselves? I would question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that would apply. There's also an assumption that one hears. I did, at least when I grew up in Orthodox educational institutions, and even in conservative movement, that there were those that the Hellenized Jews, that they became non-Jews. Today in historical circles, it's not really thought of in that way. Not in academic circles. In that there were synagogues in the diaspora. Some of them may have been syncretic. They may have had also elements of paganism in them. We talked a little bit about that last week because of the prominence of Helios, the sun god, on floors. And some people assume, and some people have written, that is part of these Hellenized Jewish communities. But we don't know enough. We don't know enough about it. But one way or another, whether it's the way Michelle offers here, or whether it's a more conservative view that it's, or a more traditional understanding of proselytization, so that it's Gentiles, non-Jews, whatever it is, it's happening more than in the time after Jesus. Okay, we can certainly agree on that. Any other comments or questions before we go on?
Well, it seems to be, this particular phrase seems to be very damning, to suggest that you are so messed up that you spend all this time converting someone and they're twice as much going to go to hell than if you did. I mean, because again, going to hell is like evil. So it would be easy to see without the context you're going to help us with, but it's easy to see
Yeah.
how people would say like, oh, if you become converted, you're going to go to hell, to Jewish. If you become
Yeah.
so that just
But
seems really damning.
I think Jesus really cares about these Pharisees. I mean, there's a whole chapter here for them. He's trying to make them better people.
Okay.
That's how I view this.
Good. And who is A? I don't know how to pronounce it. So who has commented that it's none so zealous as the converted. Yes, absolutely. That's in the background here as well. This in general here, this thing that very often those who have converted, or in our own faith traditions, all of us, those who are newly interested and devoted and committed, are very often far more careful about things than those that have been in the system for a while. Let's just say it like that. Yeah. Right. There's a scene from The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel from the first season. I think the sister-in-law is converting, and she's strict about all these things that they don't want to hear from. But she's studying for conversion, so she's very strict about it. Okay. One of the other important sources of contemporary Judaism or 20th century Judaism, Pastor Jane, that would be the Marvelous Miss Maisel.
That's right. Anything having to do with stand-up comics. Yeah.
Okay. Can we have a volunteer to read the 16 to 22? Go ahead, please. Yes. Just need you to now go. Please start again. Now you're unmuted. You're fine.
All right. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? And you say, whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath. How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one who is seated upon it.
So I've chosen not to go into great detail here of the laws of swearing, of vows and swearing, but there is a whole bunch of material in the Torah itself and then afterwards in rabbinic literature. And while it may not be that this is citing something exact, it may be a way of also laconically kind of talking about it. You're hair splitting so much in such a way that and this is the whole, you're missing the point. Right? What is it? You're seeing the trees, you're not seeing the forest, you're not seeing the forest, you're not seeing whichever one.
The forest through the trees.
There you go. Okay. And so why don't you take another one for us, okay? This one I do want to talk a little bit about.
All right. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel.
And yes, Jane, we'll get to the gnat and the camel in just a moment, because I know that's probably one of your most favorite passages in the whole Bible. But just to start here.
You know me so well.
So the spices. What is tithing? Tithing comes up twice in the Torah. Once in the context of the priestly documents before the Torah, in which the tithes go to the Levites, and the tithes are from the crops and from the herds, both from animals and from the plants, from the grain, from the olives, from all the 7 different species of agricultural products in ancient Israel. And originally actually the tithes come from just the 3 main ones, which are from grain, or olive oil, and wine. That's some rabbinic views only see those are really what you have to tithe. That's where tithing comes from. And then it became something monetary as economies changed over the years. And even not only in the church world where there's tithing, which is very common, in different versions depending on what denomination and how your own church is run. But even in Orthodox Jewish circles today, some people will talk of maaser ksafim, the tithing of money, and make sure that they're giving enough. They measure their own charitable giving in that way. Now, why the examples of mint, dill, and cumin? Aside from the fact that they're common herbs that are used in ancient in late antiquity in cooking, as probably in biblical times as well, because they're not mentioned in rabbinic literature as the things that you do tithe, right? They're not; those are secondary things. There's a midrashic tradition that is a expansion of the text, trying to make somebody look worse than he is. In this case, Esav, and it's ironic because Esav later becomes the symbol for Christianity, first for Rome and then for Christianity in rabbinic literature. And the accusation is that he goes to his father with a question about how much salt does he have to tithe, tithing the salt, which of course nobody ever says you have to tithe the salt. But that's the uber piety, the one-upmanship. And all that you're dealing with, but what we'd say in Yiddish, the Menschlichkeit, the being a good human being, being an upstanding citizen, a kind person, that you've missed. You're so preoccupied with the minutiae of legal issues. Comments, reactions? Yeah, please.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I do want to lift up because as some of you know, they're in my church. I'm very interested in like the comic angle of the text. And Jesus so often speaks in such hyperbole that it's funny. Like it's so exaggerated that it's like he's making his point by making the Pharisees sound like fools. And to help do that, in one of my show, I would take some of Jesus' sayings and I'd put them in contemporary language so we can better understand that. And this text actually, not the gnat and the camel actually, but the other first part, the tithing, I did have a little common, this is for my United Methodist friends especially, but I just wanted to briefly share this with you to give you a better idea of like how this might have been heard. Woe to you, congregations of the United Methodist Church. You make sure you pay 4/5 of your apportionment in proportion to the total church expenditure reported on Table 2, pastor's annual financial report, excluding all benevolences, capital asset expenditures, debt reduction payments, including interest payments on such debt, and all rental or lease payments made for worship, education, and office space facilities, and have neglected the weightier matters of ministry, justice, mercy, and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced, but be sure to also pay your apportionments.
Well, as the leader of Or HaMidbar, this rabbi says what she said.
That's right, baby. That's right. So, but you get the idea, like how even with all of this, like how Jesus is mocking the Pharisees, not just like criticizing them, but doing it in sort of a mock way by just all these things. Like you take one person, you go all the way from the world, and you come back and do this. I mean, it's so out of control. So that's.
And it bears its greatest fruit at the end of this paragraph, where it says, "Yeah, you're not allowed to eat a gnat, a fly or a gnat. That's not kosher. So if it fell in your soup or your thing, then you take a cloth and you strain it. So great, you got the gnat, the tiny one. You didn't eat the little tiny thing,
right?
But the camel, you're munching on the camel, which is equally unkosher, by the way.
Right.
This came to mind, this kind of thing, and we have a similar passages. There, as we'll see, there's similar kind of stuff, but we're coming up on Pesach now, and in the 80s when I was working in the ultra-Orthodox in the Haredi neighborhood of Mea Shearim, a new item was sold in the stores. The stores that sell kitchen utensils, they would always have stuff out on the sidewalk before Passover because it's like everybody's buying new stuff and you got new plastic because you can't make things for during the year kosher for Passover if they're made out of plastic or wood, only the things that are metal. Anyway, these new kind of things. And I noticed they've got these blocks, these glass bricks, from somebody has a glass wall in their house, so these glass bricks. Somebody put together glass bricks with strong fluorescent lights underneath, and they're marketing these things. And I said, what could this possibly be? Anybody know what I'm talking about, what it might be for? So you got to take a step back. We all eat salads, right? We've been reared on eating salads. So was I. I was vegetarian at age 12, and also my family. But in many societies, in traditional societies, you don't eat the green stuff, right? You get a hamburger with also you take out the green stuff, right? And so so salad was not necessarily eaten in Haredi communities in those days. That probably is by now. But on Passover at the Seder, many people use romaine lettuce for the bitter herbs. There's a huge problem with romaine lettuce, there was at the time, is that there's little tiny itsy-weetsy bugs that you can't see just with your eyes. But if you put them over this light thing, then you can see them. Now, on one hand, I shouldn't be making fun of it because, if that is how people choose to be strict, as long as I go along with Jesus in this way, as long as they're strict about it to camels as well, as long as they're strict about the other things.
Well, David, who wants to eat bugs anyway? Like, if I'm going to eat my lettuce, I'd like to know that it's just lettuce.
Except for, so there was a presentation I was at once, right? Okay. Where a presentation where somebody came to show them the magnified versions of these bugs. And there's like these, monsters, dragons, little things going on. Except for, if you take anything that we eat, and if you magnify it enough, you're going to find the little dragons. It's just a question of how much magnification you do, right?
That's true. And if you have enough wine, it doesn't really matter, right? Bring it on. It's more protein.
Ein ledavar sof, we say in Hebrew. There's no end to it.
That's true.
All right. Are we having a good time today, everybody? I just want to make sure people are having a good time. Okay.
In Southeast Asia, they eat a lot of bugs, and it's a growing trend. We're starting to see it in the United States.
They probably won't be using those blocks with the fluorescent lights.
No. I mean, you're talking bugs you can see. They got a lot of good protein in them. They're healthy foods. People who eat it say it tastes good.
Low fat and low fat.
I think you got to close your eyes and eat it.
Well, as many Jews have said before us, Gary, those from Ashkenazic land, Svetzu Zayin Yid. It's difficult to be a Jew. Not so much in New York or in Palm Springs even, but maybe in Hong Kong or in the backland, the village areas in China. Yes. Okay. And by the way, this is Gary Miller, the food scientist, who's talking here.
Aren't locusts kosher?
Yes, locusts and certain kinds of locust grasshoppers are technically kosher.
If flies, isn't it kosher if it has wings and flies?
Yeah,
we'll be sure to serve those at our movie.
Well, it's crunchy.
Yeah.
Popcorn, like there'll be popcorn. Yeah.
We'll have locust popcorn.
Right. Okay. With butter, without butter. Okay.
Both.
All right. So let's get somebody else. Who else is going to read for us now?
Well, you pick out to read it. The proselyte is actually a transliteration directly from the Greek word.
Right. Okay. So why don't you read for us? Okay.
What verse?
We are now at
25.
25. Yes.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees! First clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside also may become clean.
Okay, sounds to me like this is a part you've played before. In the school club.
I read a lot of books to the kids. You gotta spice it up.
There you go. So here's a really good example of what my beloved teacher, Professor Moshe Greenberg of blessed memory, would often talk when we studied Ezekiel together, how the prophet would be using something, talking about something in reality, but then it would melt into metaphor. Then it would melt back. This fuzzy lines between metaphor and reality. When you talk about, when you say, you are, you're straining the gnat. Well, there's actual straining. That's an actual thing to strain a gnat. So is this an actual thing to clean the outside, but not to clean the inside? Yeah, there's different aspects perhaps in the laws of purity, but here it's really kind of all metaphorical. That's what I want to say. It's like, and somebody said, are we still talking about the kitchen right now? Did we leave the kitchen? Now you're in the, it's time to look inside your inner size as a person, and make sure that you're outside, and that's going to come back in rabbinic literature when we take a look at it. Why don't you read another one for us, Mike?
Unmute. Let's see. What are we, 27? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness.
This kind of reminds me of some candy that looks really, or some donuts or something that look really good on the outside, and then you eat them and you're really sorry. But back to we're going to go back to this as well in rabbinic. There's a parallel passage to this in Talmudic literature from the same period of time. So we'll revisit this issue, but we understand it's the outside versus the inside kind of a thing. Okay, Amy, you're going to read for us a little bit today, verse 29.
Sure. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we have lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your ancestors. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how can you escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogue and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteousness, Abel, to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come upon this generation.
So now the hyperbole intensifies, we might say, right? Gets pretty nasty, gets pretty personal. In fact, one might say, I think he knows the end of the story, the person who put this into words, right? And very much, we can imagine the generation after Jesus of perhaps persecuted, a group of Jews who have gone over more to the Christian side, being persecuted by Jews who have not. There are a lot of possibilities here that are not too far. It's hard to prove. But one thing is interesting here, which we're not going to do today, and we'll have to see if we have time to fit it in. If not, we'll do it another time. We always have an opportunity to study together, is this story of the blood of Zechariah. A lot of interesting parallels in rabbinic texts. It's a fascinating thing how it got off the ground, but leads us to believe that there was an actual case of the assassination of a prophet in the temple area. And so when the author of Matthew brings this up here, it's like, oh, everybody knows, oh yeah, we know that story. We know that story. Right? But even if we don't all know the story right now, I don't know that it's not worth getting into right now. That it would take some parallels from rabbinic literature and pre-rabbinic literature. Okay, so these are our woes. If you don't count the one that is added by some manuscripts, you get 7. But on another one of these, some of the manuscripts don't have woe. So one way or another, it seems like somebody was after the number 7 here, a typological number. I use the term typological in a different way, at least in Jerusalem. We use at Hebrew University, when we use the word typological in biblical studies, these were these kind of these popular numbers that don't have too deep of a meaning. 7 is a whole number, 7 days of the week, 7 planets in the skies, but it's not as mystical, or it's not as mathematically mystical as one finds sometimes in contemporary Christian scholarship about typological numbers. But a common kind of a thing, not only certainly in Jewish literature, to find 7 of something. So before we move on to look at what's happening in the Pharisaic circles, and we're lucky because we have sources that there's no reason to doubt that they're from rabbis of the Pharisaic period, and not just imagined from backwards, and certainly not influenced by Christian literature, although we'll get to maybe something like that in a second. Any impressions, or especially those that don't know this chapter, or those that knew this chapter growing up and maybe never really felt that this could be used in future generations to totally write off an entire people or entire part of a people. Comments or questions or, yeah, please, Pastor Jay.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is, I think about, that the Gospel of Matthew is written for a Jewish Christian audience. It's written for an audience of people that are very familiar with the Jewish traditions, and because they grew up with that, and actually what the gospel is pushing people to do is to expand their understanding of to include Gentiles. That's kind of one of the major functions of the Gospel of Matthew. And I think that as we like, they would have known Pharisees. I mean, as we're talking, like, they would have understood, like, to condemn Pharisees or this or that, because that's kind of the culture in which they live. So it may strike us as being like super condemnatory, but my guess is that I'm guessing that Rabbi David is going to show us that this is kind of the kind of conversation. I mean, this kind of conversation would have been more, understood in the culture in which this is being presented. So,
excuse me. Thank you. I do have one question going back to the whitewashed tombs. If you open them up, you find bones and other negative things. Well, what would you expect to find in a grave? I mean, of course, there are going to be bones. Why is that used as an example for this particular time?
You know what? Perhaps think of fancy monuments in some of the classical cemeteries that you've been to in your life, whether it's in Germany, in Berlin, for instance. There's one Jewish cemetery which, from a period of time where many Jews were affluent and certainly not Orthodox, and there is a family tomb. What do you call a family tomb? Is there a word for it? A crypt, maybe? Family crypt?
Crypt, yeah.
A family mausoleum, a family crypt, but it's just for that family. You know, like if you're watching Ozark, they have one where they're stashing all the money, right? So all these beautiful black marble, expensive, metallic, modernistic kind of art on it. Like, what the hell? What's going on? I think of that, or a very beautiful whitewashed granite or marble or limestone building, very smooth, very ornamented perhaps. When you see that, not in the context of going to a grave, you see it as, oh, what a beautiful building. And you don't think of, yeah, but it's filled with dead people.
It's like the Taj Mahal, right?
I think it emphasizes the uncleanness that is inside of them, which is the great insult, because they strive for purity, right? And Jesus says, you got the worst purity of all, the purity of a corpse.
Right. Yes, that says the people themselves, and yet the grave itself is filled with impurity. So I think that's it, Alan. They're talking about something that just happens to be very beautiful from the outside, without expectations as to what's inside of a grave. One thing that we haven't really mentioned, maybe it was just understood, but I do want to make a point here, is that one need not understand this text in the simplest level of the Greek itself as pertaining to all Pharisees. This is talking about the Pharisees who do these kinds of X, Y, Z, those kind of things, and not a blanket statement about all Pharisees. Certainly one doesn't need to walk away from the text with that. And yet that indeed is what happened. Not only is what happened in many circles, that it not only was for the Pharisees, but for all Jews, because essentially Pharisees were, thank you for being here, Michelle. Essentially, Pharisees, they became the template for rabbinic Judaism. And so, one could say today as well, apropos the comment that Michelle made in the beginning, that I would have said, if we see again, I'll mention it to her, is that yes, there are some ultra-Orthodox Israelis, Haredi Israelis, who are quite they're nasty people. They're nasty people. They lie in business, whatever, but they're very strict with their nets, right? And they've got that light thing to look for the bugs on the lettuce for Passover. Yeah, of course there are, but and that's the people we might criticize. But to say that about all ultra-Orthodox would absolutely be unfair, right? I personally know some Haredi people who are not so concerned with forcing their will on the Israeli society. They're more concerned with how can they continue their own particular culture of cultural purity. So there's always going to be a fuzzy boundary. What happens when it means misogyny, for instance? Can we be so liberal about that? Or what happens, when there's racism involved? But that's for another time. Ron, what's the point that you wanted to make about chapter 24, verse 37?
I was just curious, Rabbi. I remember when I was in Bible study many, many years ago, how chapter 37, was brought out, and we spent some time on that. This conclusion of the whole chapter.
24:30. You mean that it's a larger literary unit?
It's like a conclusion. If I may read it, it's about maybe 10 little lines out of my Living Bible. But version 37 says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones all those God sends to her. How often I have wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks beneath her wings, but you wouldn't let me. And now your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you this, you will never see me again until you are ready to welcome the one sent to you from God."
So not 24, 23. It's this chapter. Okay. Yeah, I think I left it out because originally I was just going to do the woes, and I just wanted to limit the text. But I don't. What does this add that's not in what came beforehand, other than the?
No, I think it just ties it all together.
Okay, great. So please, everybody, go back to that when you're reviewing this, or you're telling your neighbor, or your best friend what you got to study today. So why don't we go on to? We're all right. Well, let's go on to the next section, which is from rabbinic literature itself. A little bit about the corpus that this is found in. Something we call chapters of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, or wisdom of the fathers. The fathers being the most kind of it's structured on this idea that there is a unbroken line of transmission of oral law from Sinai all the way to the time that this was edited around the year 200. And the rabbis that are quoted, the sages that are quoted here, are quoted in chronological order. The first chapter of this book begins with saying that Moses received the Torah at Sinai, and he passed it down to Joshua, and Joshua passed it down to the judges, and the judges to Samuel, etc., until they got to the men of the Great Assembly, and they we don't know anything about them from outside sources. We just know from rabbinic sources, and then they passed it onwards, and then these groups of sages from the 2nd century BCE onward, they said these things. And there's no law in this book of Avot. It's part of the Mishnah, which is a collection of laws, but in this section, it's all wisdom literature. So it's laws on how to act your life. So the first one is Rabbi Levitas, a man of Yavne. So we're talking about the first half of the 2nd century. He said, "Be exceedingly humble spirit, for the end of man is worm." Or as we used to like to say, from sperm to worm. Or from, well, I got a whole bunch of.
Blessing when a baby.
I've never heard that.
Oh, well, have you heard from womb to tomb?
Yeah.
Okay. How about from erection to resurrection?
Oh,
all right.
That's too much.
Okay.
This is we have to put an R rating.
Okay, sorry.
How about which would taste better?
Nope. Okay, there we go. It's my fault. I opened it up there.
All right.
So
it's funny though. It's funny.
So so we get the idea that this is kind of it's not a response to what Jesus said, but in other words, the Pharisees themselves you don't say something like that if there's not a problem. If you got to say it, it's out there as a problem. If we look in the next line, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, also the first half of the 2nd century. second century is repeated there needlessly. Whoever profanes the name of heaven in secret, he shall be punished in the open. That is, doing things that, being transparent, one of the things that was brought up in Jesus' name. Unwittingly or wittingly, it is all one in profaning the name, right? Doesn't matter. If you profane the name, you've made what's called in Hebrew Chilul Hashem, you've done it. Rabbi Yishmael, we're moving on little by little in increments of half centuries, more or less. His son, he who learns in order to teach, it is granted to him to study and to teach. But he who learns in order to practice, it is granted to him to learn and to teach and to practice. Meaning that if it's just about the teach, then you may get somewhere, but it's about your ego. But if you learn in order to be that person, then it's going to go farther. These are spins on the similar theme. And Rabbi Tzadok said, do not make for them a crown for self-exaltation, nor a spade with which to dig. And the spade with which to dig comes up from time to time in Torah literature. That's the way I said, don't use your science or your knowledge or your wisdom as a tool. We might say today, don't weaponize it. I don't mean weaponizing necessarily for hatred, but for self-promotion, right? So that's kind of like, that's something for clergy people always to remember, and I fall in the pit all the time. Just, know what you know and teach if people are coming to you to study, but also live what you know, right? And then finally, Hillel used to say, and he that puts the crown to his own use shall perish, that is the crown of Torah. Thus you have learned, anyone who derives worldly benefit from the words of Torah removes his life from the world. And there is a definite message in early rabbinic literature that you are not to receive any reward for teaching, any payment for teaching. No professional teachers. And many of the rabbis, at least from an idyllic point of view or a romantic point of view, the rabbis all had professions. The early rabbis, they had professions. They weren't full-time scholars. I might say that one of the challenges we find, Pastor Jane and myself and others in our interfaith dialogue, is we'd love to have Muslims at the table, but we meet as clergy who can put time aside for these kind of things and have taken time to study. In the Muslim world, an imam, a leader of a mosque, a spiritual leader of a mosque, it's not that it's his, in almost all cases, it's not his day job. It's not his job. That's like a volunteer or maybe paid, but it's a very side position. The person who is, all right, I don't need to go into details, but it's not the same. It's not somebody who's gone to school for X amount of years necessarily, and then that's what they get paid for. That's their career in their life, which has a lot of pluses to it, I think, as well. And now finally, Rabbi Yosef said, whoever honors the Torah in himself, honored by others, and whoever dishonors the Torah is himself dishonored by others. In other words, the teacher himself or the teacher themselves, they become the paradigm. They become the symbol, more than the symbol of the Torah itself, right? So it's not just you represent. You're definitely representative. There's a word I'm not missing here. The exemplar. You are the exemplar. Okay. Can we have somebody read Babylonian Talmud? Maybe somebody who's got some experience reading Talmud. Do we have anybody on the call today?
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. To love the Lord your God, to listen to his voice, and to cleave to him. This verse indicates that a person should not say, I will read the written Torah so that they will call me a sage. I will study Mishnah so that they will call me rabbi. I will review my studies so that I will be an elder and will sit in the academy. Rather, learn out of love, as the verse states, to love the Lord your God. And the honor will eventually come of its own accord, as it is stated, bind them upon your fingers, write them upon the tablet of your heart. And it states, its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. And it states, it is a tree of life to those who grasp it. Happy is everyone who holds it fast. Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Zadok says, do things for the sake of their performance, not for any ulterior motive, and speak words of Torah for their own sake. Do not make them a crown with which to become glorified, and do not make them nor make them a tool with which to hoe. That is, do not use Torah study as a means of earning a livelihood.
Right? So not weaponizing it in this understanding of it, in this translation of the Talmud's understanding. In other words, don't turn it into a career the way that I have done, for instance. The question mark after Rabbi Lazar by Rabbi Tzadok, we don't know when he lived exactly. It's hard to know exactly who he is. He's not mentioned here, maybe one other place, or maybe not at all. And there are a number of Rabbi Tzadok, so it's hard to know exactly when he lived. But we're beyond the time of Jesus here, but very much in the same flavor, the same ideology of the Pharisees here. In other words, that was a thing to be. It was a thing to be modest. Was a thing to be humble. To know what the important things of life are, not to make it into a business. But again, if you've got to say it, that means there were others in the same group of Pharisees that were not doing it, right? And so we could learn other things about Pharisees from some of the stories, and maybe we'll go there. If I need to map out the rest of our course and make sure how many times we have less, and maybe we will go there of the various stories that are brought. I can remember giving a sermon in the middle of the aughts in Fredericksburg, Texas. First time I was in. Can't remember the name of it. It's a Episcopal church there. It's the church where the Johnsons belonged. In fact, I had the honor of sitting in Lady Bird's seat. She wasn't there, but because before I came up to give the sermon that day, and I'm wearing my long prayer shawl, and my thing is to, especially in Episcopal or Catholic churches where they're very strict about the lectionary, is to touch upon all the readings in what I say. To me, that's my challenge. How do I connect them? And I remember one of them was one of the texts that are very disparaging towards the Pharisees. And I called Father Jeff before and had met him. I said, "Tell me, what are the readings to lecture?" He says, "Oh, it's like Ruth or Esther or something like that." I said, "Oh, that's great." I said, "Yeah, but what are the other readings?" He says, "Oh, well, he gave me the Psalm as well." I said, "Okay, and what are the other two readings?" He says, "Well, there's this one." I said, "Okay, cough it up. What's the last one?" The last one was very anti-Pharisaic, right? Whatever it was, I don't remember at this stage. I probably have it written down someplace. And so when I got up, I said, I said, now, you folks are probably having in your mind what a Pharisee is and who they became. Well, you know that talk about the long talit and the big fringes, whatever? Well, that's me, guys. I'm one of that's my guys. That's my peeps. My peeps are the Pharisees. And so what I'm trying to say is that to my mind, the gospel is positioning Jesus to give criticizing from within his own organization. And one might say, for me, criticizing, for instance, the state of Israel and the occupation of Palestinians, for those that don't know me, I'm not trying to start a political debate right now, but that is my views. For me, I find myself passionate about it, but want to continue to speak as an Israeli citizen, somebody who lived there for almost all my adult life. And so it's criticism from within. It's criticism out of love. It's criticism with commitment to. And the way I imagine, and I emphasize the way I imagine Jesus saying this, or even the author of the gospel saying this, is that this is Jesus still saying to his guys, to his peeps, hey, get a life, clean up your act. There's things that we want to do. Yes, Jane. Unmute. Sorry.
I was waving to Vicky and Penny. You're taking off. But I also wanted to say that this also brings to mind that when I studied in my Old Testament class in seminary, my professor, Jim Sanders, said, as much as you read these texts and see the Pharisees or whatever as like anti-Jesus or whatever, as the other, be sure to read them with you being the Pharisee. Like, read them as it's a caution for your own hypocrisy and for your own ways of like thinking you figured it all out, and you're so not walking the talk.
Amen.
Which is one of the reasons I say whenever any of us get ordained, we should just get a bumper sticker that says, "Do as I say and not as I do." Then we can just put it on our car, and then it's just right out there that you're gonna, from your religious leaders, you're gonna see a little bit of that. But I think that's another way to, like, we can see these texts in a very helpful, instructive way, and not just as a damnation of other people.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Would somebody like to read the next section?
I'll read it because it's
Go
about
ahead.
clothing.
Please, go ahead.
It's almost like reading about caftans. So I'll be happy to read it. Rabbi Yohanan asked Rabbi Benya, how should a garment of a Torah scholar be worn under his clothes be fashioned? He replied, he can wear any garment long enough that his flesh is not visible from beneath it. Rabbi Yohanan asked, how should the cloak of a Torah scholar be fashioned? He replied, he can wear any garment long enough that a handbreadth of his garment worn under his clothes is not visible from beneath it. Reverend Yehuda says that Rav, whomever says, with regard to anyone who glorifies himself by wearing a garment of the style worn by a Torah scholar, but in reality he is not a Torah scholar, he will not be brought within the boundary of the Holy One in the world to come.
So this is an example that, by the way, we just call him Rav. I forgot his full name now, but he is so well quoted in the Babylonian Talmud. He's just known as Rav. And in the Mishnah, for instance, when they have, or when the Talmud talks about Rabbi, that is Rabbi Judah, the prince who lived, around the year 200. Because they're so prominent, they're just the Rav. Or when a Chabad, a Hasid Chabad today says the Rebbe, they mean Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. That's only one they could be talking about, right? Or if you went to Yeshiva University, you talk about the Rav, you're talking about Rabbi Soloveitchik, etc., etc. Okay. So what I wanted to bring here is that yeah, it's not all. Sometimes there seemed to be a preoccupation with the clothes here, right? I have a less of an affinity towards personally, but there is there. So when Jesus is speaking about it, it's not out of nowhere. That's not just dreaming up something, from nowhere. There's this thing about clothes and how the clothes were regarded with stature and what you can, what you can't do, etc., and so on. Right? Okay. And then maybe the last one on the page, Pastor Jane.
Sure. On that day that they removed Rabban Gamaliel from his position and appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azara in his place, there was also a fundamental change in the general approach of the study hall as they dismissed the guard at the door and permission was granted to the students to enter. Instead of Rabbi Gamaliel's selective approach that asserted that students must be screened before accepting them into the study hall, the new approach asserted that anyone who seeks to study should be given the opportunity to do so. As Rabban Gamaliel would proclaim and say, any student whose inside, his thoughts and feelings are not like his outside, will not enter the study hall. On that day, several benches were added to the study hall to accommodate the numerous students. When he saw the tremendous growth in the number of students, Rabbi Gamaliel was disheartened. He said, perhaps, heaven forbid, I prevented Israel from engaging in Torah study. They showed him in his dreams white jugs filled with ashes, alluding to the fact that the additional students were worthless idlers.
So, on one hand, this feels like it's going to be a story of redemption, right? Oy vavoy, I made a mistake. No, don't worry, says the dream maker, whoever, the God, the dream maker. No. They looked like they were all right? But he uses the same metaphor as the tomb, right? Mm-hmm. They look like, but inside they were full of it. Yeah, and so this is
idlers.
Thank you for Mike. Abba Aricha is Rav, right? And so yeah, I mean, so this idea, it's not only that the phraseology is thrown back and forth. They're drawing from the same well of literature, of inspiration, of folklore, whatever. It's not only from that, but in the way that the rabbis of this period talk about themselves, or those a little bit afterwards talk about them, it fits very much with in the they maybe come to the conclusion is not so concentrated and not so caustic as we have it in Matthew 23, but it's certainly there. And so what does that say about from holiness to hatred? I would say that the intentions are good. The intentions are and all around they're good, but when you take a text out of context, or when it's read when it's read out of context, in other words, people are no longer know the cultural norms, the language of the study hall, the dynamics between the Sadducees, who were the priestly and the wealthy Jerusalemites, and those, or as opposed to those that were probably once Pharisees, but then went out to live by themselves in the Judean desert. When you don't know this context, all you get is this idea of these lousy schmucks, these Pharisees, who are hypocrites, and then gives birth to this idea which breeds hatred, very much breeds hatred. I prepared, I never know how much to prepare for this, but I did look at, let me just see if this is, if there's anything, prepared a few more texts if we want to.
But you had the Sinat Yisrael at the time, of the 70 CE when the temple was destroyed. You've had like 4 divisions at least among the Jewish people. And that was the cause of why did the second temple fall, was Sinat Yisrael, the hatred of brother for brother, sister for sister.
Right. So, Mike, the word that's actually used is sinat chinam, which is often translated baseless hatred. And what Mike is bringing us is a tradition from the Talmud that says that the first temple in 586 was destroyed because of idolatry, of avodah zarah, idol worship. The second temple, however, was destroyed because of sinat chinam, a senseless hatred, which is a romanticization of a certain situation. Yes, there were different groups. There were certainly more than 4 or the 5 that one finds in Josephus and Philo. There's a bunch of literature about that. What my studies have taught me over the years is to be very, very. I want to use the word.
Things what I'm saying. Hatred has been around. It's going to stay around.
Yeah, and competition has been around as well. And there was stiff competition, and we've seen this in the previous meetings that we've done as well. Calling. But for instance, if I'm not sure you were with us, but when one of the rabbis says about his younger brother, who is a son of Satan, then there's also says something about rhetoric. Doesn't necessarily mean that's hatred. Just means that's a way of talking. I'm not trying to apologize for it, but and so yeah, there are different types of Jews, probably far more than we have any kind of I don't want to say proof of or any kind of voices of, because think of all the smaller groups that their literature wasn't preserved, right? We haven't talked about the Samaritans, for instance, although there is quite a bit of Samaritan literature. We haven't talked about the Hellenized Jews. We talked a little bit about it before with Michelle, that were living in diaspora. We just don't know. We just don't know very much. But certainly there's different groups. The point here today was to talk about how one group criticizes itself. And when that criticism is taken, it's kind of like when people will say, I'm just saying to this group, keep it under this group, whatever, because we want to say things not only to be a safe space, but we want to say things that'll say things in this group that I won't say if I'm giving a speech at City Hall or at something else, right? Things that are said amongst. There's a group of rabbis that meets on a regular basis who are progressive Zionists. In my conservative rabbis, we say things in that group we wouldn't say to the general group of our rabbinic organization because it's not the right context to do it. Rabbi Ofer, do you have anything to add to our conversation, perhaps from your point of view?
I'm not sure if to add, but because you mentioned that you're sitting in your dad's office that used to be your room, I can relate to you instead of talking about my own father. So I wonder if we can see Jesus' reaction to the Pharisees as reacting to things that he was taught as a kid. Things like we are the chosen people, we are the people that doing only good, that relate to everybody nicely, and so on and so forth. And then when he grew up a little and go out of his school class to the world, he see, oh, there is politics and there is white lies, and it's not only truth and lie. And he's starting to hate, and he's starting to criticize where he comes from, his spiritual fathers. And when you gave the title, which I think is beautiful, From Holiness to Hatred and Back, my question is there a way back? Because your tmimut is over, like you are already have the suspicion, you will be forever suspicious about what people, especially rabbis, will tell you.
So tmimut, the word that Rabbi Ofer used is your naivete is over, your innocence is, you've lost your innocence. Yeah, that is a challenge very much so. So the idea here, Pastor Jane and myself, our idea is that the more we study these things together, we slowly erode at that prejudice or that post-judice that we have of reading the text to go back to try to recreate new meanings for it. And maybe that's a good segue to the last part I wanted to share with you, and then we can discuss it afterwards, which is the lessons taken from a Roman Catholic priest from this particular passage here. And let's see how much we can agree to this. Okay. Just if one person could let me know that it's showing up correctly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who are the modern Pharisees? Why do they still get it wrong?
Well, if there's one group within the Gospels who are particularly prone to criticism by Christ, it is the scribes and the Pharisees, and that's especially put forth in the Gospel for the Tuesday of the second week of Lent, when Jesus says, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them." So one important thing Jesus is pointing out is still the importance of the law of Moses and the prophets. And in pointing out the lack of good example in the scribes and the Pharisees, he is not negating the importance of the law and the prophets. And what exactly is he criticizing in the Pharisees and the scribes? He's not criticizing the heavy burdens, because let's face it, the law of Moses is very demanding. It's a very high standard that God's people are called to live. In the same way, the Catholic Church and Christianity have very high standards that we're called to live as followers of Christ. So he's not criticizing the heavy burdens and the high standards. What he's criticizing is the fact that they will not lift a finger to move them. They are neither a good example in living them, nor do they give the people the support that they need from their shepherds to live these high standards that God has given them. As followers of Christ, we look at the leaders in our church, whether they are ordained leaders and the bishops, the priests, and the deacons, or whether they are people who are of positions of shepherding that are actually teachers, such as parents to children and teachers to students. None of us carry a higher standard or a different standard from anyone else. As a priest, I do not have a higher standard than the people I work with and work for and serve. But rather, I have the same standard I'm called to live with them. They don't have a different standard from me, and I'm not held to a higher standard than anyone else, but we are all kept to the same standard. But as a teacher, and as a priest, and as a shepherd, I am called to be, in particular, a good example and a support of the people in living this gospel we are all called to live as followers of Christ. So the standard I'm called to is not a higher standard in terms of the teachings and the standards of the gospel. My higher standard is in how I teach it, how I live it, and as a shepherd of souls, how I support those who are called to live it. And so for all people who are called to be teachers of the faith, parents to children, teachers to students, bishops, priests to their flock, deacons, let us remember that we are all called to the same gospel standard. But for those who are in that position to teach that, we must be A, that good example, and B, that strong support as shepherds of souls, because it is a high standard and it is a heavy burden to live the standards given to us by Christ. But we are called not just simply to remind people of those standards, but to give them the support they need so that we together can live those standards as a community of Christ's followers.
That was Father William Nichols, who's he's a parish priest in the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption in San Francisco. At least that's the information I have. I don't know if it's up to date. Before we ask others for reactions, I would like to ask the other two clergy. There may be other clergy members that I don't know here, but how does this resonate with you, Pastor Jane and Rabbi Ofer? It's not about being Roman Catholic, obviously, but about being a teacher or a pastor or a rabbi. Pastor Jane?
I think that's a very fair estimation of that, that when you're teaching, you do have a higher standard of either showing how you get it or being really open about how you mess it up. I think sometimes it's as helpful to show how, I'm struggling with it, and it's okay to struggle with it, because that's the beauty of it. That's where you find the grace and where God is in the depths of who you are. So it's kind of a both and, but that you're willing to take the mantle of being. In fact, I'm doing my sermons about Paul, like in the Pauline corpus this Sunday, and his whole thing was be imitators of me. That was the way the I don't know if it was as true in the Semitic world, but certainly in the Greek world, that was the way you taught. It's like you imitated your teacher, and that showed that you had their spirit living in you, and then you're able to live it out and act it out in the world. And so as religious leaders, we are, for all the right reasons, an actor. Now, I know after the Oscars this week, maybe we don't want to think of it that way, but we really are. And it's important for us as leaders, and all of us all of us as religious people to know that our actions are being followed, but especially as leaders, I think.
Thank you. Ofer?
Yes, it's a fine line, because I know that people that we are shepherds, and people look up at us and say, okay, we have standard to look at, but at the same time, I know that I'm failing. I'm constantly failing in performing the level that I predict for myself. And I think it's important for me to show that too, that side. Yes, I'm doing wrong, and I want to be. I'm inviting you, my kids, and at home to say, well, you said something, and now you do the opposite, or you did wrong, and I think that my tendency to apologize and to acknowledge it is maybe the best lesson I can give.
Thank you. Tada. Other reactions from anybody? Well, I guess you're hungry. You want your it's time for coffee, huh? Okay. All right.
We're still living with all these woes.
Can I ask a question? Do the Haredim, do they have television sets?
By and large, no. The ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Haredim, feel that there's not much to be gained, or there's a lot to be lost by watching certainly commercial TV. That being said, that wouldn't mean that a particular movie or a particular documentary or something, that would be shown on a video, a controlled way, would be all right. It's not the technology of TV; it's the cultural break, the breaking through the walls, that have been set up, the fences around their lifestyle and ideology. And for that reason, they don't use smartphones either. They're what are called in Hebrew, or maybe here also, kosher phones. So you'll see often Haredim with flip phones, with the old kind of flip phones, or they have a kind of a smartphone which can only get to certain things, because there's a lot of amazing technology. Online now we can get all of Talmudic literature with so many corpuses from medieval Jewish commentaries on the Talmud itself. I mean, obscure stuff. And it's all there right now in a terribly sophisticated way on multiple sites, many of them with English translations. There are books that you can't find anywhere. You haven't been able to find them for hundreds of years. There are books that the single printed edition in some library was scanned and copied. All that stuff is brought to us by the internet. So it's not that the internet is bad per se, but there's so much, they might say, evil there. Let's just say there's so many challenges. So they stay away from that kind of a thing. Somebody else mentioned Amy Jill Levine, who is I've never met her personally. I would like to. A wonderful scholar. I use this Jewish annotated New Testament I've showed you before, which she edited, but different scholars have written commentaries to the different books of the New Testament, and there's a rich section in the back of different themes and concepts. And so, yeah, she's a very respected scholar.
She's very funny.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
She's hilarious.
Okay. Do you know her personally, or you've just seen her online?
I've got to hear her, the interfaith seminar she did in Louisville, Kentucky, about 6 or 7 years ago on a whole weekend. I heard her 4 or 5 times in a weekend.
And I believe she's an Orthodox woman as well, I think.
Well, she's from Boston, and I don't know, because she doesn't wear a kippah or anything like that, so.
Right. So Orthodox women usually don't wear a kippah. Some cover their hair. Some wear wigs, but usually modern Orthodox women, the kind that would be a professor in a university, by and large, don't cover their heads either. Okay. So Ron, thank you for your comment. Thank everybody. Are there any other parting comments before we say goodbye?
All I can say is that I think we can invite our super Orthodox friends to see A Serious Man, because I bet they'd like that film.
I think this was a great class. I want to thank you, both of you, Jane and Rabbi. And I think it's time to eat our mint, dill, and cumin.
Oh, tied or untied?
Yes, but eat it in a bowl that you've cleaned the inside of at least.
That's right. And make sure there's no gnats. Make sure there's no net. Put that fluorescent light on there.
And we'll skip the worms.
No more worms. That's right.
Okay, everybody. Be well. Thanks for being here.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. Bye.